For this case study, we're going to be taking a look at astro landscape photography. Now, this isn't like astrophotography where you've got deep space galaxies and nebulae. This is when you want a landscape along with stars and maybe the Milky Way in the background. Now, you might be wondering why we're filming this during the day, and that's just to get a better looking video. Later on, we will go out at night and take some more pictures, but right now it's just better to show you guys what's going on with the camera, the lenses, and the techniques in broad daylight rather than at night. So first, let's talk about camera equipment. Now, for most types of photography, it doesn't really matter what camera or lens you use, but astrophotography is a little bit different. It's very demanding on your equipment, including both your lens and your camera sensor, as well as other equipment such as your tripod and things like your flashlights. So first, let's talk about cameras. When it comes to cameras themselves, the most important factor is the high ISO performance. And this matters because when you're shooting astrophotography, you're almost always going to be at ISOs of 1600, 3200, 6400, or even more, depending upon your lens. Now, if you've got a camera that doesn't do very well at these high ISOs, you'll end up with a photograph that has way too much noise and really bad colors, and you won't be able to post-process to get the image that you want. Now, personally, I use the Nikon D800, and that's pretty good for this type of photography. It has a full-frame camera sensor, it does fairly well at high ISOs, but there are also other cameras out there that are better, such as the Nikon D5 or the Sony a7S II, or even some of the newer medium-format cameras. Now, in general, what you'll find is that the larger the sensor size, the better that the camera will do at this type of photography, just because it has a better high ISO performance. Next up are lenses. Now, when it comes to your lens, there are three main important factors for astrophotography. The first is your light gathering capability. Second is your wide open performance, and then third is the focal length itself. Now, in terms of the light gathering capability, with astrophotography, there's a little bit of a difference compared to traditional landscape photography. When you're taking normal landscapes, you'll probably be stopping down your aperture fairly significantly to get a big depth of field. With astrophotography, though, you want to get as much light as possible, as quickly as possible, from those really dim stars. So you'll probably be shooting at a really wide open aperture. Now, since we're shooting at such wide apertures for astrophotography, it's important that your lens can perform well at these settings. Most lenses are significantly softer at their widest apertures, and they also experience this optical problem called coma. Now, coma is when bright points of light, like stars, start to streak, especially near the edges of your frame, and this can lead to very distracting photos. This is also why you'll see a lot of professional astrophotographers shooting with really expensive lenses that minimize coma and are sharper at wider apertures. Now, the final feature of your lens that's important for astrophotography is your focal length. Now, why is this? Well, the Earth is rotating, which means that when we take pictures of stars, they appear to move across the sky, and your focal length affects how much they appear to move through your composition. For example, if I have a super telephoto lens, just a tiny bit of star movement will be magnified in a way that appears really streaky across my photo. However, if I've got an ultra wide and the star moves just a little bit, it can still appear as a pinpoint of light. Stars will always move, but an ultra wide angle lens means that they move proportionally less. Now, at this point, we've already talked about why it's important to have a camera with good high ISO performance and why it's important to have a lens with good wide open performance. Now, how does the movement of stars across the sky tie into the third variable of exposure, your shutter speed? Well, let's operate under the assumption that you want your stars to be pinpoints of light and you want them to be as bright as possible. This means that you have two factors to balance. On one hand, you don't want to have a shutter speed that's too long because then stars will begin to streak across the sky. However, you also don't want to have an exposure that's too short because then the stars will be very dim and you won't be able to see that much detail in the sky. So how do you achieve this balance? Well, you can actually calculate the optimal shutter speed for a given astrophotography image by using a simple formula called the 500 rule. Now, this formula says that you take the number 500 and divide it by your focal length or the 35mm equivalent focal length of your lens if you use a crop sensor camera. The ultimate value is the number of seconds that you can use for your final exposure. For example, I have a 20mm lens on a full-frame camera. That means 500 divided by 20 gives me 25. I can use a 25-second exposure without getting significant streaks of stars across the sky. Now, one more thing about lenses for astrophotography is your choice between a prime lens and a zoom lens. Now, typically, when you're taking pictures of the night sky, you want the widest focal length possible as well as the largest aperture possible. This makes prime lenses a very attractive choice. For example, my 20mm f1.8 lens is very wide at 20mm and it also has a large aperture of f1.8. However, there are also zoom lenses that perform very well for astrophotography, such as Nikon's 14 to 24mm f2.8 lens. This lens is very wide at 14mm, and it also has a fairly bright aperture of f2.8. More importantly though, it gives you the flexibility to zoom in and out and change your composition. This makes lenses like this, as well as prime lenses, very attractive options for astrophotography. Along with your camera and lens, another crucial piece of equipment to use is a tripod. Now you can't hand-hold a photograph at 25 seconds long, so you need something stable to put it on. If you don't have a tripod with you, even a table or a rock would do, but you need something rather than just hand-holding. Along with that, the ground that you're standing on has to be stable. You can't take astro photos from a moving car, or from even a car that's running, or a boat, and you can't have your tripod in moving water. It needs to be completely still, or else the stars in your photograph will be squiggles rather than points of light, and the rest of your photograph will be fairly soft. The weather conditions that you shoot in also have a huge impact on the stability of your photos. For example, if it's really windy, even with a good tripod, you might end up with blurry shots. Now there are a few things that you can do to counteract this. First, if your tripod has a center column, lower it. Those things cause a lot of vibration when the wind hits them. Similarly, the last leg sections that you should extend of your tripod should be the thinnest ones, because those cause more vibration than the thicker ones at the top of your tripod. Finally, if it's really windy, consider lowering your tripod so that you have a more stable base for your composition. If you do all of these things, then your astrophotographs will be significantly sharper in windy conditions than they otherwise would be. Another piece of equipment that I never leave home without is my flashlight. First off, you're taking astro photos, it's going to be dark, you've got to be able to see where you're going. That's a given. But flashlights are also important for two other reasons. If you want to illuminate the details in the foreground of your landscape, you can use the flashlight to light paint on them during your exposure. Also, a flashlight is very useful if you're trying to find somewhere to focus in your photograph, and that's what we'll talk about next. So one of the most challenging aspects of astrophotography is focusing, and that's simply because everything is so dark that your camera can't acquire focus on your subject. So how do you get around this? Well, there are a few different techniques that you can use depending upon the situation. When it comes to photographing stars, the first thing to know is they are at infinity. They are as far as any object can possibly be in a landscape photograph, so you have to focus your lens at infinity as well. Now, if your lens has a hard stop at infinity, like some manual focus lenses, then that's fine. You just turn it to infinity, so long as you've already tested and you know that it's sharp right there, then that's fine, you can just set it and leave it. Most modern lenses, however, can actually turn the focus ring past infinity, and that means that you don't have a hard stop where the stars are perfectly sharp, and that's when things get tricky. Now, to counteract this, there are a number of techniques that you can use. One of them is just to scan the horizon and look for distant objects that are very bright and large that you can lock focus on. For example, the moon or bright lights in the distance. Now these are different from stars because the stars are so dim that it's difficult, even in live view, to zoom in and focus on them. But if you're talking about the moon or distant lights, then you're very likely going to be able to zoom in on live view and manually focus the lens so that it is at infinity. However, you won't always have bright objects along the horizon or a moon that you can focus on, so you need to know some techniques for other situations as well. One of them that I tend to use is to take a bright flashlight and shine it at the farthest object that still gets some light on it. For example, if there's a tree that's 100 feet away, I can shine the flashlight on that tree and then focus there. Even though 100 feet is not the same as infinity, it's close enough that the stars will still be sharp. The other technique for a situation like this, if you have a friend with you, is to get them to hold the flashlight, run into the distance, and then shine the flashlight on themselves. Again, you can focus on that. It's not at infinity, but it will be close enough that your stars will still be sharp. Now, in both cases, I highly recommend using live view, zooming all the way into 100% and manually focusing. Even if there's enough light to see your subject, that does not mean that your camera can autofocus on it accurately. Manual focus will be much better in these situations. Once you've acquired focus, make sure to switch your lens to manual focus if you haven't already done so. This is so that you don't accidentally trigger the autofocus, which hunts around and messes up the setting that you already have. Similarly, you've got to zoom in and check to make sure that the first photo you take is actually sharp on the stars. If not, you will need to reset the focus so that the rest of your photos will be exactly how you want. Also, every 5 or 6 photos, I highly recommend zooming in and making sure that your focus is still exactly what you want. You wouldn't want to take 2 or 3 sharp photos, accidentally bump the focusing ring, and then take 30 blurry photos on the same night. Now that we've talked about all of these techniques, how do I actually put it into practice in the field? Well, with my Nikon D800 and 20mm lens, my first step is to do the 500 rule. So 500 divided by 20 gives me a 25-second exposure. So my first step is always to set that for my shutter speed, or to be safe, maybe set 20 seconds instead. Next up is aperture. My lens is an f1.8 lens, and it would let in the most light at that setting. However, I get a little bit of coma and also some blurry corners at f1.8, so I typically stop it down to f2 or f2.2. It's not much, but it does definitely boost the sharpness in the corners. Third is my ISO. Now this one really depends upon the scene. If the Milky Way is really bright, I can use a slightly lower ISO, and if it isn't showing up very well, I might have to use a higher ISO. But typically the range from 1600 to 6400 is a good ballpark for most photos. Fourth, and a setting that I always use for astrophotography, is long exposure noise reduction. And what this does is have your camera take 2 photos, one after the other, where the second photograph is completely black. The camera then takes the noise in the second photograph that's caused by the heating up of the camera sensor, and then it subtracts it out from the first one. So what this does is it gives you a much cleaner final photo. So make sure that you always have long exposure noise reduction turned on when you're doing astrophotography. Up next is focusing. Now, since I don't have a lens with a hard stop at infinity, I always use one of the 3 techniques mentioned earlier. Either I focus on a distant object like the moon or bright lights, and that's how I find infinity focus, or I might just shine my flashlight on a distant object or hand it to one of my friends so that they can run and shine it on themselves. Now, you might not use all of these exact same focus or exposure settings for your own setup, but the general idea should be very similar. Now that we've got all of the technical settings established, the next step is to find a location. Now we've already scouted for a location, and as you can tell, it's getting pretty dark outside, so we're going to be going there pretty soon to film the rest of the case study. So how did we scout for the location that we're going to shoot at? Well, we had a few things in mind when we were planning this shot. First, we wanted the Milky Way galaxy above the Grand Tetons Mountains, but we also wanted all of that reflected into a still pool of water. Now we don't know about the wind, but hopefully the reflection of both the mountains and the stars will be visible below. In order to tell where the Milky Way was going to be, we used an app for our phone that superimposes the Milky Way on the landscape. This way we knew exactly what time we wanted to shoot and where we wanted to shoot. Otherwise, we would just be flying completely blind. We'd have no idea where to go or when the Milky Way would show up, and it would be completely chaotic. Sometimes the best way to take a good photograph at night is to plan everything during the day. If you know exactly where your tripod's going to be set up, exactly how your composition's going to look, you'll have a much better chance of getting the photograph that you want. Now keep in mind that you can take Milky Way photographs pretty much anywhere, but the reason that we had to do all of this planning is because we wanted the grand landscape in front of it. Also, another important thing that we had in mind was the light pollution. Now this particular location is very far away from cities and towns, so the sky is completely clear and you see a lot of stars. But if you're trying astrophotography, say near a big city, then you might not end up with photographs that you like. The air might be golden and orange, you might have cars driving by, and none of this will add to the photograph that you're trying to take. It's much better to be in a location with a clear sky and a beautiful landscape in the foreground, rather than just trying to make it work in any old location. Similarly, bright objects like the moon can have a significant impact on the appearance of your images. Now this impact might be good or it might be bad. For example, if the moon is illuminating the landscape, it could bring out some of the details in your foreground, and that could be a really good thing. However, if the moon is right next to the Milky Way and you're trying to photograph both in the same frame, the moon might end up overpowering all of the stars, and that definitely would not be a good choice for a photograph. So in the end, it all depends upon the specific image that you're trying to take, but all of these variables are well worth considering. Lastly, an important consideration is safety. By definition, you're taking pictures at night, so it's very easy to get lost or trip over objects. You've got to always know how to get back to your car, always bring a flashlight, and if possible, take a friend along with you. All of this is especially true if you're in an area where there are a lot of bears. We literally just saw a black bear 5 minutes ago, and that is not something that you want to stumble across in the dark. So when you're taking pictures at night, just be especially careful and pay attention to your surroundings. This will help you minimize any danger and just have as much fun as possible taking pictures. So that's basically all about astrophotography that we're going to cover in this particular case study, but if you want to go further, there are many different options. For example, some photographers will use star trackers that rotate with the movement of the Earth to take much clearer photos of the Milky Way. Or you can use those same trackers with a telescope attached to your camera so that you can take pictures of deep sky objects. Whichever route you want to go, there are tons of ways to explore this really exciting field. Alright, so we're at our location, we've been taking some Milky Way photos, the dawn is starting to arrive, and it was an incredible night for Milky Way photography. So we had the stars going across the sky right over the mountains. They reflected into the water, which was completely still. There was no wind, no clouds, and it was a beautiful, beautiful night. So let's walk through everything that I did to make this photo happen. Now first off, based on the 500 rule, I should have set my exposure at 500 divided by my 20mm lens equals 25 seconds. Just to be safe, I set it at 20 seconds, but it's within that ballpark. Then onto my aperture. So in order to get the best balance between the light that I gathered and then the coma and corner performance, I set my aperture at f2.2. It's a little bit farther stopped down than the maximum aperture of f1.8, but again, it's within that general range. Finally, in order to get the bright photo that I wanted, I set my ISO to 3200 and then I just took my photo from there. So now let's talk about my composition and framing. This one was actually pretty easy because I knew exactly what I wanted. I knew that I wanted the Milky Way, the mountains, and then the reflection of the mountains and the Milky Way. So essentially, I just centered my composition because the two main elements of the frame, the Milky Way and then the mountains, were both relatively close to one another. By centering the composition, I was able to get a good balance, and that ultimately led to the photo that I wanted. Also, one of the other important things that I did was move my camera forward closer to the water to exclude all of the useless grass in the foreground. Otherwise, the bottom of the photo would have been very distracting. As it is, this is almost exactly how I wanted the final composition to be. So one thing that I haven't pointed out yet is why this particular location worked so well. Well, as you can see, you've got the stars in the background and then the Milky Way, but you also have the layers of the trees and the grasses along the center of the frame. These add some depth to the photograph that make it really pop and stand out. Along with that, you've also got the still water on the bottom, which reflects everything so perfectly that it creates a nice harmony between the bottom and the top portions of the frame. Now, if I hadn't visited this location during the day, it would have been very tough to find this exact composition. We had to kind of walk a few minutes to get to the right spot, but because we had pre-scouted it, it wasn't all that hard. So now that we've got the location and the camera settings, how did I focus this scene? Well, as you can see, we've got the grass in the middle ground, and I shined my flashlight directly onto that with the brightest possible beam, and then I put my camera into live view, zoomed in to 100%, and manually focused my lens. Now, I was already set at f2.2 when I did that, just so that I could be as accurate as possible to the final scene. Now, obviously, I had my long exposure noise reduction turned on for this photo to decrease the amount of noise that was in it. However, there are other ways to reduce the amount of noise in your astrophotography images. For example, you can take multiple photographs of the same scene and then blend those photographs together in specialized software, which will combine the bright points of the stars and then still reduce the amount of noise. Similarly, if you're taking something like a time-lapse and you don't want your camera to automatically take a long 30 or 25 second dark frame after every photo, because that would cause jitters during the time-lapse, then you can actually manually take a dark frame yourself at the very beginning. All you've got to do is make sure that you set your exposure and your ISO to exactly the same settings that you otherwise would be using. If you're doing this manually, obviously you've got to put your lens cap on your lens, otherwise you'll just be taking the exact same photo and it won't be a dark frame to subtract. The reason that you're doing this, again, is because of the heat of your camera sensor can create noise, but that noise is identical in every photo, so a dark frame that is only composed of noise can subtract out all of the noise from the normal image. Now, I mentioned light painting earlier, and we actually did do some light painting for this scene. What we did was we took the flashlight and we shined it just very, very briefly across some of the grasses. However, I don't really like that result quite as much as the one without light painting. As you can see here, the differences are fairly pronounced. Still, if you like the one with light painting, feel free to do this for your images. It definitely can add to quite a number of photos. Alright, so we've got the camera settings, we've got the nice location, and the photo looks really good on the back of the camera screen. So let's bring this image into Lightroom and see what we can do with the final photo. So I'm back in the studio after a beautiful night of landscape photography, and it's a little bit warmer now, I've had some more sleep, so it's a good time to start editing this photo. And as always, the first step is just to plan, have a goal in mind for how I want the photo to look. So let's take a look at it. And as you can see, it looks pretty good, but there are a few issues. On one hand, you can notice in the corners, there's some significant vignetting. And this is even more visible if you look at the little thumbnail picture right here. You can see how significant the level of vignetting is. And on top of that, the whole photograph is just darker than I would like it to be. So I'll definitely need to correct for those two issues. Along with that, you can see the Milky Way itself, although you can clearly tell that it is in the photo. When I was actually out in the field, I definitely saw the Milky Way far brighter than I was able to see any of the other stars. And in this case, in the actual photo, it's not quite as obvious. So I definitely want to make sure that the viewer sees the Milky Way and that I can bring it out as much as possible. And on top of that, I'd also like to adjust some of these colors above the mountain, just because when I took this photo, it was maybe 2 hours before the sun rose, so I definitely had some blue color in the sky, but not enough to make it very saturated. So in this case, it's a little bit dull, and I can definitely make those colors pop out a little bit more. So let's dive right in and start editing. So the first thing I'm going to change is just the exposure slider, and that's because I don't want to start editing other things before I even can see what's in my photo. And this is already fairly dark, and that's just typically the case with nighttime landscape photos, just because I'm already maxed out at my shutter speed. I'm already using a fairly wide aperture, so my photo by default is going to be relatively dark. And I also didn't want to use too high of an ISO, because if I do, then I might blow out some of the stars actually. And that means that it's always best for nighttime photos to end up with a photo that looks a little bit dark and then just brighten it in post-production. So right here, if I'm scrolling down, the brightness now looks pretty good, but I'm going to actually adjust the camera calibration. It's set to Adobe standard by default, and I would like to change that just to camera standard. And that's a usual thing that I do. So camera standard, okay. And so you can see that definitely did change some of the colors. It made the blues a little bit more blue. There's definitely still some work that needs to be done here though, and my first step is going to be just reducing the highlights. And the reason that I do that is to bring out some more detail in the sky, because as it was a little bit lower in contrast. You couldn't necessarily tell what was going on. So as it is, it's starting to look pretty good. I'll probably go down to -40 or so. And then one of my favorite tools for adjusting stars is this, the highlight slider under the tone curve. And the reason why I like this tool is because it influences such a small range of tones that for nighttime photos, it will almost brighten only the stars while leaving most of the rest of the image very similar. And so I'll show you how that looks. At +43, +76, you can see how drastic that changes, and then I'll also decrease it all the way. It really just does a great job of bringing out only the stars. So I'll probably leave it somewhere +50 to +60. The specific amount just depends upon your photo. Then my next step is just to reduce this vignetting. So as you can see, there's very significant amounts of vignetting, and there's an easy way to correct that. Just enable profile corrections. So I'm going to click on enable profile corrections, and things immediately look very strange. The photograph is far too bright, and as you can tell, it actually also messed with the photo's composition just a little bit. It stretched some of the image along the corners. And that's because the enable profile corrections option not only affects vignetting, but also distortion. So what I'm going to do now is just eliminate the distortion correction by putting it down to 0, because there's really no need in this photo to correct distortion. There's none that's visible, and also I just don't want my composition to change even slightly. And the next thing that I need to do is adjust the vignetting slider. Now, as it is at a full 100 on the vignetting correction, it's clearly way too bright in the corners of the image. But as I just showed, with 0 vignetting correction, it's definitely significant vignetting that I end up with in this image. So I'll probably want to compromise. Maybe something like, I don't know, 30, 35. In this case, that looks pretty good. So at this point, my next step is to adjust the color. Now I want to start with color temperature because it's the most global color adjustment that you can do. So I'm going to scroll up and make it a little bit bluer, because in this case I'm getting a little bit more yellow than I would like, and the Milky Way by itself has some yellowish brownish tones. But the problem in this case is that they're kind of conflicting with the little bit of pre-sunrise that I'm getting here. It's just the very tail end of the blue hour, and I want to make sure that my colors in the photo are relatively standardized, not too much conflicting color contrast here. So I'm going to decrease it. That's too much, maybe somewhere around 5100. That seems pretty good. And as far as tint, I'm going to make it a little bit more magenta, because in this case I can definitely see some greens, especially down near the horizon in this area. So I'm going to increase the tint somewhere to maybe 25. And as you can see, that had a very nice effect on the color of the overall image. But there are still a couple of things that I'd like to do. Specifically, I'm going to scroll down to the HSL panel, which once again is one of my favorite panels for this type of work. And I can see a little bit more purple than I would like in certain areas of the image. particularly along the top of the frame in these stars right here. So I'm going to take the purple slider, I'm just going to make it a little bit more blue. Not too much, maybe minus 30 or so. And a similar issue that I can see is there's actually a little bit more aqua in this photo than I would like. Especially look near the horizon in this area. To me, it seems just a little bit too turquoise, and I would like it to be more of a solid blue color. So I'm going to take this aqua slider, and it doesn't have a major effect, as you can see, sliding it all the way in both directions. I'm literally just going to put it all the way to plus 100. And that's because it doesn't have a huge effect, but it has enough of an effect that it does influence the overall appearance of the blues. As for the blues slider itself, I generally like it where it is, roughly around 0. I might add just a little bit, maybe plus 5, so that it's slightly more purple, but this isn't a huge deal. I generally like, at this point, how the color's looking in the photo. One of the other things that I do want to do here, though, is to increase the brightness of the greens. And that's because you can see a little bit of green in the foreground near these trees and bushes, and I think that it could be very good if people are able to see a little bit more detail in them. So I'm going to increase the luminance of the greens, maybe to plus 40. I'm going to do the same for the luminance of the yellows, just because there's a lot of yellow in some of these green plants. So yeah, about plus 40 on both of them. And that's starting to bring out a little bit more detail for sure in some of those areas. So now I'm feeling pretty good about the colors in this image. I might tweak them a little bit as we go on, but for the most part, I feel pretty happy about them, which means I'm about to start working on a few other adjustments. Things like local adjustments, dodging and burning, adding some contrast, and maybe changing the crop and tilt of the image just a bit. So let me start with that one. So I'm going to open up the cropping tool, and as you can see, there are a couple of issues here. First, it does seem as though the left-hand side of the photo is a little bit higher than it should be, and so I'd probably want to bring it down. And on top of that, there's also just a tiny little bit of a tree that's visible right here. And in fact, I'll close out of the crop so you can see it a little bit better. Right there, that's pretty distracting. So I'll just be able to crop that out fairly easily, and in fact, it will probably crop out on its own as a result of me lowering the left-hand side of the image. So yeah, that's exactly what it does. I like this framing. I'm not really going to bother adjusting it too far to the left or too far to the right. I'm going to keep it probably in the center and just click enter. So at this point, I'm happy with the crop as well. I'm happy with the color, and I'll just do a few more minor adjustments. So as you can see, scrolling up, I haven't yet adjusted contrast. So I'm going to change it, not too much, but maybe to plus 10 or so. And the thing here is that this photo already has a lot of pop. It attracts a lot of attention, but just a little bit of contrast can give it an extra kick that I think works really well here. So after that point, I still haven't messed with very many of these. I'm going to increase the shadows. And the reason why I'm going to increase the shadows here is because some of this detail, especially in these trees and bushes, should be really nice if I can see a lot more of the colors and textures there. So let me increase the shadows. That's looking pretty good. At about plus 30, I can see significantly more detail. I like the colors that I'm getting, and I also like some of this stuff right here. As you can see, this stick, I kind of like it because it mirrors this shooting star that I have right here, and it almost completes the whole idea of reflection that I wanted in this image. I have not only the reflected Milky Way and the mountains, but I also even, in a sense, reflect the shooting star, which is pretty cool. At this point, I think that my next step is just going to be to make the Milky Way look a little bit better. So in order to do that, let me first do a couple of global adjustments. I'm going to increase the white slider a little bit beyond what I have it right now, probably something like 15. And for the black slider, I'm also going to decrease it a little bit. And this just adds contrast, so I'm going to put minus 5. Oop, not minus 15, minus 5. Yeah, that seems pretty good. So now I'm ready to do some more local adjustments, specifically on the Milky Way, and maybe even on the Milky Way's reflection. So I'm going to open up the brush tool, and let me create one brush only along the darker areas of the Milky Way. That's going to be things like this little area, going up through here. And you can see. Okay. So I'm going to turn off this overlay tool, and I'll increase the clarity a little bit. So you can see as I increase the clarity and decrease the clarity, it actually changes pretty significantly how much you can see the Milky Way. And on top of that, I'm going to change the contrast, definitely increase it a little. See, there's the difference between negative 100 contrast plus 100 contrast. I'm not going to do too much, maybe 12 or so. And at that point, I generally like how the shadow portions of the Milky Way are, but I definitely want to emphasize the lighter portions as much as I can. So I'm going to do a new brush tool, And the important thing here, as always, is subtlety. I don't want a Milky Way that looks fake or unlike how I saw it in real life. It was just that in the field, it was very, very bright. And in this photo, you really don't see it to that degree. So I'm going to increase the brightness of this edge area of the Milky Way, and I'll turn on the overlay tool. And maybe an area there as well. I'll change around the brush size a little bit. It's not a perfect art. It's more just trying to ask yourself where in this photo it should be brighter in order to have the best possible effect. And something like that seems pretty good to me. I'm going to turn off the overlay tool and see what happens if I increase, say, the whites tool and maybe the highlights a little bit. That's looking pretty good, actually. In some areas it might be a little bit too much, so I'm going to just open the eraser tool and put the flow down to maybe 40% or so. The specific area that I'm thinking of is right around here. To me, it looks like I increased the brightness more than I would prefer. So I'm just going to go over that, and it might seem subtle moment to moment, but if I turn on the overlay, you can see that there's actually a pretty significant decrease in the amount that I've brightened and darkened that area. So I'll just do a little bit more erasing and then turn off the overlay tool, close it, and you can see that that's actually a pretty significant difference in terms of how well you can see the Milky Way in the photo. So let me actually go back to before I added any brush strokes and show you that's how the Milky Way looked like beforehand. That's how it looks afterwards. And it might seem like a subtle adjustment, but once again, too significant of an edit here will be very distracting. And it's pretty significant actually in terms of how well the viewer can now see parts of the Milky Way. However, there are still a couple of things that I'd like to edit here. On one hand, you can notice there's a little bit of what looks like light pollution near the horizon at the bottom of the Milky Way. And that's something that I probably want to correct for. It's just a little bit too yellow, so I'll probably do a selective blue brush, and I'll also add a little bit more clarity or contrast. So let me do that now. I'm going to add, this is the third brush now that I've got, and I'll turn on the overlay. So this to me is the area that looks like it has the most yellow on the horizon. It's significant enough that it definitely stands out. It's noticeable in my opinion. So I'm going to turn off the overlay and just make this area a little bit more blue. I'm going to change the color temperature minus 15 or so, looks good. I'm going to add just a hair more magenta, and I'm also going to add some clarity, potentially a little bit of dehaze, and contrast. So that's actually looking pretty good now, but I'm going to do something similar to just the reflection of the Milky Way. Because once again, my main goal for this image was to create something that looked very harmonious, where every part of the photo had a reflection or some repeated element somewhere else in the image. And as it is, you can see some parts of the Milky Way in the reflection, but it's not as pronounced as I would like, and it's certainly not as pronounced as it is in the top half of the frame. So let me create a new brush, and I'm mostly here just going to increase the brightness of the lighter areas. I think that it's overall, in fact, too dark, and so I don't really need to darken the areas that are already dark. So I'm going to add a tool right here, and I'll turn on the overlay so you can see what's going on. And just this little area, and then this little area can be a little bit brighter. Some spots here too. I might add or subtract bits off of that after I change around the highlights adjustment. So let me change the highlights adjustment now. So it's kind of subtle, but you can see I'm actually probably going to go all the way to plus 100 on highlights. And I wonder what clarity does. Now clarity in this case is actually brightening the image more than the highlight slider did, which is actually the case fairly often. So I don't want to go too extreme on clarity, because as you can see, yes, that is significantly brighter, but it also looks very fake. So I'll probably stick to something like maybe plus 10 on clarity, maybe plus 12, something like that. And in my opinion, that's starting to look really nice, and you can now see more of the reflection in the same way that you can see more of the Milky Way on the upper half of the frame. So I'm going to close out of the brush tool and just take another minute, step back from the photo, and analyze what I still have to do. So looking at this image, it's pretty good, and I like a lot of the colors, a lot of the contrast, but there are definitely a few more things that I would change. For example, take a look at the bottom of the photo. In my mind, this area is still too dark. I can adjust it, not super significantly, but I'll probably end up creating a gradient at the bottom of the frame just to maybe reduce the contrast a little or brighten it a little bit. And similarly, I think as much as I like the way that the Milky Way looks, and as much as I think that it's the proper brightness, some of the stars around it are actually a little bit too bright, either to the left or right of the Milky Way. And I think that by darkening those stars a little bit, I'll also end up essentially boosting the apparent contrast of the Milky Way. I won't actually change how the Milky Way itself looks, but by changing the stuff around it, it will make it pop out a little bit more. So I'm going to accomplish both of those things by adding gradient tools. So I'll start with the bottom of the frame. I'm going to add a relatively subtle gradient. It's going to go fairly soft, and then you can see the area in green is where it's affecting. So it's mostly just the darker portion at the bottom. I'm just going to decrease contrast. I might even increase shadows just a little bit, but not very much at all, because I don't want this to be a super significant effect. Just something that, gets rid of an ugly black bar along the bottom of the frame. So closing that out, to me the bottom of the frame now looks actually pretty good. But the top of the frame, I'm still going to decrease the brightness of some of those stars. So let me do that now. One more gradient tool. I don't want to change the brightness of the mountains themselves, so I'll have to be very careful about where I place this, because if I darken the stars, and as you can see right now, if I also darken the top of the Grand Teton, so I'll press the O key so that you can see the overlay, that probably isn't exactly what I want. So we'll see how it looks. If it's too significant, I might move it up a little bit. I'll just do a tiny bit more right now. And one of my favorite ways actually to change around the brightness is not just by adjusting this slider that says exposure. Instead, I prefer things like contrast or clarity or shadows or highlights, just because they're more targeted. And in this case, once again, if I try to do exposure, as you see, it kind of makes the colors look a little bit weird, and it dulls the way that they are. So instead, I'm gonna boost the contrast, which darkens it, but doesn't really affect the saturation. If anything, it increases the saturation. So something like +15 contrast is starting to look really good right there. So now that I've added that contrast, all that I'm going to do is eliminate it from the Milky Way itself. So that way the rest of the sky is a little bit darker, but the Milky Way stays exactly how I had set it earlier. So what I'm going to do is enter the brush tool within the gradient tool. As you can see, it's not the separate brush tool, it's just the different type of mask already in the gradient. So I'll click that, and then I'll go down to Erase, and let me press the O key so that you can see exactly where I'm currently affecting. So right now I only have the erase mask set to a flow of 40. I'm going to just increase it to maybe 80 or so. And just decrease it in the area of the Milky Way. So let's see, almost done. And then I'll press O one more time. And that looks pretty good. So right now I've done most of the major edits that I'm interested in, but there are still a couple of minor things that I'd like to do. For example, as you can see right here, this area in the grass is very dark. So I'm going to close out of the gradient tool and actually open up a brush tool. So I'm going to paint in just some areas selectively that I'd like to brighten, and I'll show you the mask that I've just created. So something like this, I'll end up opening up the shadows. So, oh, well, that's a little bit of a Lightroom glitch, isn't it? There we go. And that looks a little bit better. So at this point, I've lightened it up about how much I want. I think it's nicer because we can now see some more details in there. But I'd also like to brighten up one other area in the photo, and that's this, the snow on the mountains. So I'm going to create a new brush tool and shrink it a little bit. And I'm going to zoom in specifically to the mountains, and I'm going to paint on the snow. So it'll take just a moment for this to load. So brand new brush tool, painting only on the snow. And I'll turn on the overlay. I think it could just be nice just to give the mountains a little bit more detail and a little bit more character as well. Because it's still pretty cool that we were able to take pictures here at night while there was still a little bit of snow on the top of the mountain. And one other cool thing that you can see is in this area, you can see the little speck right here. And my assumption is that that's someone who's actually hiking up the mountain. Presumably they're going to try to climb it. Maybe they're camping overnight and they just have a light on. But no matter what it is, I think it's kind of cool. Some photographers might prefer to mask over this area and delete it in their photo. I'd probably actually just keep it just because I think that it's pretty neat. So I'm going to turn off the mask overlay, and I'm just going to brighten up the highlights a little. So once again, that doesn't do a huge amount, and the clarity will actually do a little bit more. See, so there's 100% clarity is too much right there. So I'm going to probably go somewhere around 30. And now that that's done, I'm going to close out of it, but I'll also point out there's a lot of noise in this image right now. And that's because I haven't actually done any specific noise reduction, and Lightroom is just on its default values. And right now its default values are not working very well. So I'm going to scroll down to the noise reduction and sharpening panel and see if I can fix some of these issues. So right now the sharpening is set at 25, which is its default value, and that one's actually fine. I'm just going to leave it there. But the radius I need to shrink some, so I'm going to put that down to 0.5, and I'm going to put detail up to 100. And that's just because I like the particular algorithm that Lightroom goes through when that's the setting. Detail at 100, radius at 0.5. And also in this image, because there is a significant amount in the foreground where there aren't that many details, what I'm planning to do is increase masking. And normally I don't try to do masking beyond 10 or 15, but in this case, I already have a lot of noise in this image, and there's some areas with very, very clear lacks of detail. So I'm probably going to go up to maybe 30 or so. And next up would be noise reduction. And at this point, Lightroom does have some automatic color noise reduction applied. That might even be too much. I'm going to probably decrease it. Even though this is a high ISO photo, you don't necessarily still need something like 25 color noise reduction. And in certain images, you will be able to tell that a high color noise reduction can decrease the saturation of certain colors and just make them look overall slightly less appealing. So next I'm going to increase the luminance noise reduction, probably to something like 25. We'll see how that looks. And there's a noticeable improvement if you take this, which is slowly forming, and you compare it to prior to any sharpening or noise reduction enabled. That's a pretty big difference. So personally, I like it at the settings that I have after the fact. And you'll also notice that in the detail areas, after Lightroom loads, in these detail areas, you're still actually getting a very good amount of sharpness, and you can see plenty of the details in the mountains and the trees, as well as the stars. So I'm actually fairly happy with this. You can certainly tweak it as you like, and different photographers will have different preferences. You might say, right now, maybe the luminance noise reduction is a little high, so I'll lower it. Or maybe the masking is a little bit too much, so I'll lower it. But, this is all down to what you want to do, and personally, I'm pretty happy with how it is. So at this point, I feel like I'm mostly done with the main edits that I was planning to make. I'll zoom back out so you can see the whole image. And now is just a good time to evaluate it. And I generally like how it looks right now. I might go down and add just a little bit of dehaze so that I can get a tiny bit more contrast to the image. Not much, just something like maybe +10, +11. And now I'll just one more time look over the image. And as I see it, I like the Milky Way. I think that I've got really good detail there. I think that the water at the bottom looks the proper brightness. And I also like the amount of detail that I'm getting in the grass and some of the foliage. So I feel like I would consider the post-processing of this image to be complete. So to wrap things up, let me just show you a quick before and after so that you can see exactly what edits I've made. So here's the final version, and that's before. So as you can tell, that's a very significant difference, but the main difference here is just how much brighter the new one is. So actually, to make it easier for you to see all of the color and contrast adjustments that I've made, let me go all the way down to the bottom of the history panel. Because remember that the very first adjustment that I made was just to brighten the exposure. So right now, if you look at that photo, which just is the brightened exposure, I will then scroll back up and I'll show you the brand new photo. And when I undo and redo to flash between these two images, you can see here's the new one, there's the old one. So they're very similar in how bright they are, but the new one clearly has better color, better contrast, and more detail in some of the areas. When it comes to post-processing nighttime photos, this example is fairly typical. You'll usually have to brighten your exposure, for example, because in the field you typically won't be able to capture enough light to have a bright enough photo. And similarly, you'll also usually end up reducing noise more significantly for photos like this than you would for daytime landscapes. And along those same lines, usually the colors at night will be a little bit more tricky to work with, just because you might not have captured as much color detail in the first place. And lastly, trying to get the Milky Way to appear solid and stand out from the other stars in the photo is something that might take some local adjustments. But once you've had more and more practice post-processing this type of photo, you'll realize that these extra steps aren't all that difficult. And once you do master them, your nighttime landscape photos will be just that much better.